The U.S. assault on Huawei may do far more damage than expected to the Chinese telecoms giant and its U.S. business partners, and both are now pushing back. On the one hand, Huawei has redoubled its legal fight against a proposed U.S. ban of Huawei business activities with Americans, which it denounces as, quote, unconstitutional. On the other hand, Huawei's U.S. partners are reportedly lobbying behind the scenes against the ban. But will their voices and this lawsuit to curb this assault on Huawei? If not, what are the potential long-term consequences for both the Chinese company and its U.S. partners? Joining our discussion are in the Beijing studio, Thomas Luo, co-founder and CEO of Pingwest, a tech company, and from Shanghai, Professor Olaf Groth of the Hult International Business School, a private school with campuses worldwide. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. Now, as I said, a recent Reuters report cited sources related to a late May meeting where executives from top U.S. chip makers, including Intel, Qualcomm, and Xilinx, discussed how to respond to the U.S. government ban. This isn't about helping Huawei, it's about preventing harm to American companies, as one of the people interviewed for the story saying. So, Thomas, these American chip suppliers are said to be quietly pressing the U.S. government to ease its ban. Why do they have to do this in quiet?
I think the quiet, I think the pressing is very quiet because it's not a really large-scale lobby into the D.C. or this sort of things. And so far, we didn't see so many coverage or the official statement from the companies to see how they cope with this kind of the problem. But I think the major reason for their quietly pressing is about, and I think is considering about the whole atmosphere in the U.S. in both the right and left standing on the same point to getting on top on China at this moment. So I think and they really worry about that and they care about that. So then they just do things just under the table quietly, and to send this kind of their worrying and to the Department of Commerce and to the White House, I think, and they have to do that at this moment. But probably we should probably just take a longer time to see whether this kind of pressing will be getting open.
Professor Groth, as I said, one of the people interviewed for the story said this isn't about helping Huawei, it's about preventing harm to American companies. Exactly what are they talking about in your understanding?
Well, Xin, that's a great question. It is very clear that a lot is at stake for these companies. American tech companies are inextricably tied to the Chinese market and to Chinese companies in this global economy, and specifically in the tech industry. So we are looking at revenue shortfalls that are associated with this ban of anywhere, I've seen numbers between 13% and 18% of global annual revenue for some of these companies, which is a very substantial number. So I'm not surprised that these companies will voice their concerns to the Commerce Department and others, and to some degree that's a normal process because we want American companies to speak up and have a voice and let us know what the repercussions are, what the implications are of this ban as the government deliberates whether the ban is in fact the right response to these allegations.
Thomas, are we just looking at loss of orders, in terms of billions, maybe tens of billions in a year or two, which could possibly be filled by other companies or maybe not? Are we just looking at some short-term interests here, or are we looking at further potential, much more disastrous consequences for the U.S. tech companies as well?
Yeah, I think it's just like, and we just mentioned just like Intel or Qualcomm, and they just get hurt, or they may just lost some kind of the orders during this kind of the ban. But just by taking a long view, and we see both these kind of the tech companies, especially this kind of the hardware tech companies and this kind of the chip makers, and they already set up the very big R&D center in Beijing, and also meanwhile in Beijing, just like Qualcomm during the past 5 years, and Qualcomm really strengthened their R&D human capitals in Beijing, rather than just like Intel or other some kind of, or including Microsoft, or including Google. And Google now, instead of a very a solid artificial intelligence center in Beijing. So I think just by taking longer, and the most important things for I think the most important consequence for this kind of event is their trust, or how they would do, or how they would cope with their R&D center in Beijing. Will they just will the headquarters just for more important projects or some kind of R&D projects into their China office or to their Beijing R&D center, or how this kind of these things will strengthen? I think it's not a really good thing, because in most of the tech companies in the global wide are trying to just to set up the R&D centers in multiple countries and different countries, especially for those kind of the countries who has more younger talents, engineering and scientists talents. I think just now it will really weaken this kind of the competitiveness in terms of the R&D things.
On the other hand, Huawei's order do take up a considerable portion of the revenues of many of these tech companies. For instance, one of the chip makers is reporting $2 billion loss because of its cutting off business potentially with Huawei. So are we, Professor Groth, are we just looking at any damage to the R&D capabilities here in China, or are we looking at these chip makers, these tech companies in the United States having to compromise their R&D even in the United States or in other parts of the world because of reduced revenue coming from the Chinese company Huawei?
Yes, and we're looking at damage to the global R&D environment, period, the global R&D establishment overall, because Chinese R&D is so intertwined with American R&D, with European R&D. Investments, talent, data, funding for R&D spans borders. And so as we now inhibit participation of Chinese researchers in Western R&D or vice versa, really the global science, the global R&D establishment starts to suffer. China has ascended to co-leadership in many technology areas such as artificial intelligence and even some biotech fields that used to be the exclusive domain of American or European R&D establishments. They have become valuable partners for these Western counterparts. And so as we now drift into what some in Washington have unfortunately called Cold War 2.0, tech finds itself at the center of that Cold War. It's a very uncomfortable position because it is such a broad conflict. We've always had trade disputes around intellectual property between companies across the Pacific as well as across the Atlantic. But this one is really becoming so heavily politicized and caught up in the two very different models of how both America and China treat the global economy that it is becoming a very dicey game.
Yeah. Well, just in a conversation CGTN live streamed with the founder and CEO of Huawei, Ren Zhengfei. There is this American scholar by the name of Negroponte. He said, our president, meaning President Trump, has already said publicly that he would reconsider Huawei if we, meaning Trump and Xi, can make a trade, or China and the US can make a trade deal. So clearly that is not about national security. You don't trade national security. It's something else. Thomas, what are we talking about here? Yeah,
sure. Obviously, I actually believe obviously it's not a security issue. It's about other issues, about other factors. And for example, first it's about the competitiveness of the Chinese technology, and obviously Huawei is one of the icon of that. Especially in terms of the very high-end research like the artificial intelligence and or the chipset makers or some kind of the 5G technologies. Of course, it's about technology competitiveness, and it's one thing. And the second is it's also a part of the so-called trade war, the trade negotiation. I think. So let's wait and see. So it's good to see the two presidents now will probably set up a phone. They already set up a phone call. Probably they will later set up a meeting in Japan. So I think let's wait and see how the Huawei issue will be just put in the table to see.
Professor Groth, what is your answer to the same question exactly? What is it that is at stake here? And also, Chinese President Xi Jinping said he expects to meet with U.S. President Donald Trump to talk about, besides trade, the fundamental issues concerning U.S.-China relations. What are these fundamental issues here?
Well, certainly, the current trade war is evidence of the competition of models between the United States and China, both economic development model as well as the political model. So there is a difference in those models that is very uncomfortable for both sides of the Pacific. Secondly, though, Mr. Trump is now engaged in a series of renegotiations of trade agreements such as the ones in Canada and Mexico, and China is really the biggest of them all. And so he is trying to posture and negotiate the third deal, and really a crown jewel for him in his public perception. We must not forget that he has just announced his re-election campaign and that we have national elections next year. And so this is all caught up in making sure that these trade renegotiations, these new agreements, solidify his record as a tough deal maker. And he knows that he has a tough deal maker on the other side of the Pacific who is spreading his wings across the world through the Belt and Road Initiative, gaining a lot of economic and trade influence. And so this is a big deal. Now, I'm not quite as ready as your panel on Monday to dismiss the national security element of this. Mr. Trump has been on record as saying a lot of things, but the American judicial system and the Justice Department are, for all their hiccups and quirks, are fairly robust institutions, and they cannot simply be told what to prosecute. And so we have to see what the facts are and what the evidence is. Innocent until proven guilty.
Okay.
Right?
A final question, real quick. A Commerce Department official said the agency routinely responds to concerns or inquiries from companies regarding the scope of regulatory requirements, but such conversations do not influence law enforcement actions. So, Thomas, is there any hope that the company's lobbying effort could produce some fruit?
Well, I think the most important thing is that we should wait for the next quarter's earning report of this kind of the big companies like Qualcomm or Intel or Microsoft, especially for Qualcomm.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, let's wait and see. Many thanks to Thomas Law, founder and CEO of Pingwest, and Professor Olaf Groth of the Hult International Business School.